Hello everyone and welcome again to the SQL Server F1 series in which we will discuss the common issues that the SQL Server database administrators face frequently. Thank you all for your interactions in the previous video that encouraged me to continue with that track. In this video, we will go through a number of the SQL Server connectivity issues and show how to troubleshoot these issues. First of all, if any one of your clients complains that he is not able to connect to the SQL Server instance, you need to collect these information from him to start your troubleshooting. The first thing, the complete text of the error message along with the error code. Then, whether the error is intermittent, which means that the issue happens only sometimes, or consistent, meaning that it's happening all the time. We need to check also the fully qualified domain name of the SQL Server machine, or in the case of clustered installation, the FQDN of the virtual name. If you are using a named instance, try to get the instance name. Also, try to get the network libraries and ports that the SQL Server instance is listening on. Also, if the connections are failing from an application, try to get the connection string from the application. You may find these information in the web.config file for the ASP.NET application. Most of this information can be collected also from the SQL Server error log. Once you get this information from your client, you need to check the following connectivity basics to exclude it from the issue root cause. First, ensure that the SQL Server service is started and you see the following message in the SQL Server error log, which is SQL Server is now ready for client connections. This is an informational message. No user action is required. The second thing, try to verify the basic connectivity over the IP address, which means try to run a ping-a command, CMD command, with the SQL Server machine name or the SQL Server IP address. And if you notice any issue, you need to work with your network administrator to fix that issue. Try also to check if the SQL is listening on an appropriate protocols by reviewing the error log. Also, try to check if you are able to connect to the SQL Server using UDL file. If it works, then there may be an issue with the connection string that is used by your client. Check also if you are able to connect to the SQL Server from other client system or different user logins. If you are able to, then the issue could be specific to the client or the login that is experiencing this issue. Also try to check the Windows event logs on a problematic client for additional pointers. Also, try to check if the network drivers are up to date. Also, if you are experiencing login failures, ensure that the user has a login at the server level and appropriate permissions to connect to the database that the user is trying to connect to. Let's see how we can take advantage of the SQL Server Configuration Manager in checking and troubleshooting these points. So from the SQL Server machine, try to go to the SQL Server Configuration Manager with a red box icon and check the SQL Server services, where you need to make sure that the SQL Server service is in running state. Also, you can check from here the protocols that the TCP IP, for example, TCP IP protocol is enabled, and you can check which port the SQL Server is listening at. For example, it's 50,000 in my case, so that it's listening to a non-default port, taking into consideration that the default port for SQL Server is 1433. Also, we can check from here the aliases, as we will see later, and the alias is a name that help us to connect to the SQL Server service using another name, where you can see from here the alias for the server SQL2 is SQL2 with port 50,000, which means that I can connect to that server without providing the port number. And this is what we can see from here. If I just write SQL2, I should be able to connect to that server without the need to provide the port number. Here we go. You can see that it's connected successfully. Also, regarding the UDL test, let's try to see how we can perform a UDL test to connect to a SQL Server instance. Just right click here on the desktop, new text document, and we need to go, for example, here just to make sure we can change the extension. So we will allow to show the extension of the file. So let's go back here and name it test.udl. And confirm to change the extension. Then we will see a UDL file. Double click on this file and provide the name of the server, which is a local server here, or we can name it SQL1. We can use here also the authentication method and perform test connection for a specific database or the default database. And we can see here the connection tested successfully. And the nice thing with the UDL is that you can choose the proper connection provider or driver that can be used to connect to a specific database engine. For example, if you have an Oracle database or DB2 database, you need to have the provider for this engine installed to your machine, and you can perform the test from here. Also, let's see how we can take advantage from the SQL Server error logs and check the information about the SQL Server instance. So from our SQL Server instance, we need to go to the management node, and under SQL Server Logs, let's see the current one, which is the latest one after the latest reboot for the SQL Server instance. And once opened, try to scroll to the bottom of these logs, which indicates the beginning of the SQL Server Logs. Here you can see the logs when the SQL Server instance started. For example, this is the version of the SQL Server instance, all information about the version and the edition of that instance. And for example, what you can see here that it's using a mixed mode authentication, which is SQL Server authentication and Windows authentication. Also, you can see what's the service account, and all of these are information and messages that we can take advantage of in order to see and take knowledge about the SQL Server instance. And this is the startup parameters that shows where's the master database file, MDF and LDF are located, and the error logs of the SQL Server also, where is it saved. Also, this is the collation, which is the code page for the SQL Server, taking into consideration that this can be configured at the database level and table or column levels also. Here you can see that it started up the master database. What other information also we can see from here? It's a part of an always on availability group. And from here you can see that it's listening on port TCP port 50,000. Also, it's listening on the named pipe protocol in addition to the TCP, and these are the protocols that it's listening to. You can see here also it's listening at port 1434, which is the UDP port for the SQL browser, and also this one for dedicated admin connection, which is the DAC connection. So this is TCP port DAC connection, and it will start recovering or starting the databases. It's listening also on port TCP 5022, that's using for always on availability group. And you can see that the recovery for the database is completed, and this is for always on availability group. And we need also to search for important messages, such as that it's ready for connections. Let's try to search for ready. That's it. You can see that SQL Server is now ready for client connection. This is a confirmation that the SQL Server is able to receive connections and serve these connections. This is another error. It's not an error, it's a message that we need also to take into consideration once we talk about the missing SPN. Here it's saying that SQL Server is attempting to register a service principal name for SQL Server service. Kerberos authentication will not be possible until this SPN is registered. This is also an indication for an issue that we will talk about in this video. The first error message that we get when having connectivity issue with SQL Server is a network related or instance specific error occurred while establishing a connection to SQL Server. The server was not found or was not accessible. Verify that the instance name is correct and the SQL Server is configured to allow remote connection. This is a generic error, but we need to concentrate on the complete error message here. For example, you may get an error indicating provider SQL Server interface error 26, error locating server or instance specified. Also another one that the SQL Server network interface error locating server instance specified, or a connection attempt failed because the connected party did not properly respond after a period of time, or established connection failed because connected host has failed to respond. Another error, which is related to named pipe provider, couldn't open connection to SQL Server, the network path was not found, or no connection could be made because the target machine actively refused it. So all of these are for us, let's say, indicating that there's a connection issue. We are not able to connect to the SQL Server, but till now we are not able to identify the cause of that connectivity issue. So this connectivity issue that we mentioned in the previous slide could be caused by one of many reasons. For example, it could be that incorrect server name being specified in the connection string, or in the server name dialog box if we are trying to connect using SQL Server Management Studio. Also, it could be an incorrect alias on the client machine. As we mentioned previously, if we try to connect you to the name that is mentioned in the alias, but the alias is not correct or not pointing to the correct server, then we will face the same error. It could be also an issue related to firewall between the client and server, blocking the port SQL Server instance is listening at. As we mentioned, the default port for SQL Server is TCP 1433. Some installations also use a non-standard port, similar for the one that we showed in the previous demo, in my example, which is 50,000. So the firewall may be blocking either of them, maybe the default port or the non-default port that we are using. Also, it could be an issue with the SQL Server provider that is not started. because we know that the client applications that are connecting to the named instance of SQL Server will use the SQL browser service on the system where SQL is running. Why it will use it? It will use it to enumerate the port that the SQL is listening on. So if the SQL browser service is not started, the connection would fail. Also, if the SQL Server browser service is already started, we need to check the UDP port 1434 because it could be blocked also by the firewall. So if the SQL instance is a named instance, it may have either been configured to use a dynamic port or a static port. In either cases, the underlying network library query the SQL browser service that is running on your SQL Server machine via UDP port 1434. And this is to enumerate the port number for this named instance. So if the firewall between the client and the server blocks this 1434 UDP port, the client library cannot determine the port and the connection will fail. So to identify that issue, we need to try to connect to the named instance using the port number appended to the server name using the format which is a server name / instance name, port number, and see if that works. But if it doesn't work, then it's an indication that the firewall is blocking the UDP port 1434. To confirm it, we need to use a method called port query. So to use the port query, we need to install the port query UI tool from Microsoft download page and double click on the UI, and we need to choose to query for SQL Service, then query to see which ports the SQL Server is listening at. You can see here from the query that this is the name of the instance that is installed on this machine, and the UDP port 1434 is not listening. And you can see from here it's not listening because the SQL browser service is stopped here and it's blocked by the firewall. The firewall can be checked from here. If we check firewall rules, you can see here the impound rules and try to find ones for SQL. Try to search for on the ports, local ports, and search for example, port 50,000 for SQL Server, and we can see that it's not allowed, so it will not allow for remote connection unless you have a naive firewall rule, such as the ones that allow all protocols from any to any, which like you are keeping the door of your house open all the time, which is not safe. Also, it's not safe here also for your SQL Server. So you can see also here that the TCP port 1433, it's not listening because we are using a non-default. So if we try to provide another port, which is 50,000 and a query, you will see that it's listening at port 50,000, which is the SQL Server is listening at that port. The second type of connectivity errors we may get are cannot generate SSPI context error, or login failed for user NT authority anonymous login, or login failed for user null. All these error messages are related to an issue with SSPI configuration. Okay, what's SSPI? SSPI, which is Security Support Provider Interface, it's a set of Windows API that allows for delegation and mutual authentication over any generic data transport layer, such as TCP/IP sockets. So, SSPI allows for a computer that is running on a Windows operating system to securely delegate a user security token from one computer to another computer over any transport layer that can transmit raw bytes of data. So, the cannot generate SSPI context error is generated when SSPI uses Kerberos authentication to delegate over TCP/IP, and Kerberos authentication cannot complete the necessary operation to successfully delegate the user security token to the destination computer that is running SQL Server. So, when an instance of SQL Server database engine starts, SQL Server tries to register the SPN for the SQL Server service, which is the error message that we saw previously in the error logs. So, when the instance is stopped, the SQL Server tries to unregister the SPN. For this to happen, the SQL Server account needs read and write service principal name permissions in the Active Directory. But if the service account doesn't have these rights, the automatic SPN registration does not happen and you need to go with to your Active Directory admin to register these SPNs manually for the SQL Server instance so that you can enable the Kerberos authentication on that SQL Server instance. In this scenario, if you are using a named instance, it will be more convenient to use a static port for that instance, because if you use a dynamic port, the port number can change each time the service is restarted, and the manual registration for SPN for that instance is no longer valid. So it will not be able to register automatically, and the manual will be invalid because this port is not used for now for the SQL Server. But in the environment where the SQL Server is clustered, this automatic registration of SPN is not recommended. Why? Because it may take more time to unregister the SPN and register the SPN in the Active Directory than the time it takes for the SQL Server to come online. So if the SPN registration does not happen in time, it may prevent the SQL Server from coming online because the cluster administrator is not able to connect to the SQL Server. So, Kerberos authentication failures can happen due to a variety of reasons, include missing SPN, which is the SPN is not registered in the Active Directory. Also, incorrect SPN entries, which is the SPN exists, but the port number is incorrect, or it exists on a different account other than the SQL Server's account. Also, it could be occurred due to a duplicate SPNs, which means that the same SPN exists on multiple accounts in the Active Directory. It could be also an issue with the SQL Service account is not trusted for delegation. So if you are using local system account, the middle server should be trusted for delegation in the Active Directory. So in order to identify the root cause of that issue, we need to use the Kerberos Configuration Manager to diagnose and fix the SPN's issue. Also, we need to use the Kerberos Configuration Manager Delegation tab to confirm and work with our Active Directory administrator in order to enable the delegation for that SQL Server service account. And this is especially useful in troubleshooting linked server issue. For example, if the SPN check out fine, but you still run into an issue with the linked server queries, it could be an indication that the service account is not configured for delegation or to delegate these credentials. So that we need to work with our Active Directory administrator to enable delegation for that service account. So let us see how we can use the Kerberos Configuration Manager to check the missing or duplicate SPNs and the delegation issue. So after installing the Kerberos Configuration Manager at your machine or your SQL Server instance, you can provide the server name and credentials, or just click on connect. So it will connect automatically and show the information about the connected instance. So these are information about the connected instance, and in the SPN tab you can see the available or missing SPNs on for your SQL Server. For example, this is the SQL Server service account, and this is the port, and it's giving that there's a missing SPNs for that instance, and you can see that for each service for each SQL instance we need to have minimum two SPNs. So in order to generate it, we can generate it one by one or click on fix to perform the change directly if you have permission in the Active Directory, so that if you click Fix, this will be registered directly to the Active Directory. I mean, register this SPN, or you can click on Generate All, save it, for example, here, name it 1, and we can see it from here, which is under desktop, I think, where we save it. And from the location where we save it, you can edit it and see what are the SPNs to register. You can see here that it's asking for set SPN -s, which is registering the SPN. These are two commands. That it's a CMD command, so it will register this service on this server. Under this service account, it will register to create this SPN and another SPN for the port number. So in order to fix this SPN issue, you can ask your Active Directory admin to run these commands to the Active Directory. Also, we can see from here under Delegation to check if we have any linked server issue. We can check the delegation for this service account. For example, we can see here this account is not configured or not trusted for delegation. So if there is any linked server issue, we can fix it by asking the Active Directory admin to register or to grant permission to this account for delegation. If you are trying to connect to the SQL Server instance and getting the error login failed for user without mentioning the username, this means that this computer was not able to set up a secure session with the domain controller in this domain due to the fact that the remote procedure call was cancelled, and this may lead to an authentication problem. So we need to make sure that this computer is connected to the network, and if the problem persists, we need to contact the domain administrator. And this empty string means that the SQL tried to hand off the credentials to the local security authority subsystem service, but there was some problem. Either the local security authority subsystem service was not available, or the domain controller couldn't be contacted. So we need to check the event logs on the client and the server machine to see if there are any network or Active Directory related messages around the time of failure, and if we do, we need to work with the domain administrator to fix that issue. Also, if you are trying to connect to the SQL Server instance and getting the error login failed for user and it's mentioning which user, then this is a failing SQL login due to one of these reasons. For example, the database requested is offline or not available, such as in the case of the secondary replica of always on availability group that is not configured as a readable replica. And this can be fixed by checking the database availability in the SQL Server Management Studio. Also, you may face this error if the user does not have permission to connect to the requested database, and this can be fixed by checking the user permission or trying to connect using another user. Thank you for your time and hope you find this useful. Try to share this with your friends and colleagues to spread the knowledge for them all. Happy holidays and stay safe.